The air hung thick with the metallic tang of ozone and something acrid, like burnt sugar and melted plastic. I pushed through the hastily erected tape, the yellow barrier snapping against my coat, a sound swallowed by the oppressive silence of devastation. Dr. Aris Thorne's bioengineering lab, once a paragon of sterile innovation, now resembled the aftermath of a localized meteor strike. My boots crunched on crystalline shards and pulverized drywall, each step a testament to the explosive force that had ripped through this space. Overhead, the ceiling grids sagged like broken bones, exposing a tangle of severed conduits and blackened insulation. Dust, fine as confectioner's sugar, coated every surface, obscuring the precise geometry of destruction. Reed, the lead detective, a man whose patience wore thin with every passing minute, greeted me with a curt nod. His face was smudged, his usually pristine uniform wrinkled. "Glad you're here. Another fine mess for you to unravel." He gestured broadly at the chaos. "Initial assessment points to a catastrophic equipment failure. Thermal runaway, maybe a pressure vessel breach." The man was working with highly volatile compounds. Could be a tragic accident. Or, given his reclusive nature and the scope of his research, a deliberate act. The security logs are a nightmare. No external breaches, no forced entry. It was an inside job, one way or another. I didn't respond, my gaze already sweeping past him, absorbing the panoramic ruin. Thorne's body, or what remained of it, had already been carefully removed, leaving a faint, irregular outline on the scorched floor near what was left of a massive containment unit. The heat had been intense, charring the concrete, fusing metal to ceramic. "He was alone, as far as we can tell," the detective continued, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Security footage shows him entering last night, no one else leaving. The blast occurred sometime around 0300. Automated systems flagged the incident. Pretty cut and dry." Cut and dry. The phrase tasted like ash in my mouth. Nothing in my line of work was ever cut and dry. I began my methodical sweep, moving from the periphery inward, my eyes calibrating to the nuances of destruction. The equipment, even in its ruined state, hinted at unimaginable complexity: bespoke bioreactors, advanced spectroscopic arrays, intricate fluidic systems, all designed for precision beyond the current commercial standard. This wasn't just a lab, it was a fortress of scientific pursuit. The air conditioning system, or what remained of it, still hummed faintly in a distant vent, struggling against the pervasive heat that lingered. I knelt beside a warped workstation, its composite surface bubbling and peeling. A shattered monitor lay face down, its internal components twisted into abstract art. I reached for a small, cylindrical device, half buried in debris. It was a data logger, its casing surprisingly intact, though scarred. Its indicator light was dark. My focus drifted to the burn patterns. They were widespread, certainly, consistent with a high-energy event. Yet, something nagged at me. The primary blast zone, centered around the containment unit, showed a distinct radial scorching, as expected. But there was a secondary pattern, fainter, almost like a ghost, that seemed to emanate from a different point, closer to the far wall. It was too subtle, too diffuse to be a direct result of the main explosion's concussive force. I moved closer to the secondary pattern, my gloved fingers brushing against the soot-stained wall. The charring here was less severe, more superficial, but it had a peculiar, almost directional quality. It wasn't a general scorch, it was a series of delicate, feather-like streaks, fanning out from a point roughly at eye level. This wasn't consistent with a single, massive thermal event from the containment unit. If anything, it suggested a localized, smaller ignition, almost like a directed energy release, before or simultaneous with the main blast, but originating from a different source entirely. My internal alarm bells, usually a quiet hum, now rang with sharp clarity. My eyes narrowed, tracing the delicate, almost invisible lines of discoloration. I pulled out my magnifying loupe, adjusting the focus. The streaks weren't just soot. Embedded within the blackened paint, almost imperceptible to the naked eye, were minute, shimmering flecks. They caught the ambient light, reflecting it with an unnatural, almost iridescent glow. Not metal. Not glass. Something else entirely. Something synthetic, alien to the typical composition of a lab explosion. I scraped a tiny sample into a sterile vial, my movements precise, deliberate. He wouldn't see it, not yet. This wasn't a byproduct of Thorne's high-octane bioengineering. This was something specific, something placed. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't suicide. Aris Thorne had been murdered, and someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to make it look like he'd been consumed by his own ambition. The true nature of Thorne's groundbreaking research, and the perilous implications of his final project, had just become the most dangerous variables in this equation. I felt a familiar tension coil in my gut. My work had just begun. The acrid scent of scorched electronics still clung to my clothes, a phantom reminder of the chaos I'd left behind at Thorne's lab. The journey to the military medical facility restricted autopsy section was a blur of flashing lights and muted conversation from the accompanying officers. My mind, however, was still sifting through the wreckage, trying to piece together a narrative that refused to fit the official accident stamp. The facility itself was a study in stark efficiency. Concrete walls, polished steel, and an unnerving quiet that swallowed sound. Thorne's body lay on a stainless steel table, a sheet pulled up to his neck. The forensic pathologist, a woman with a no-nonsense gaze and hands that moved with practiced grace, nodded a silent greeting. "Read," he acknowledged, his voice low. "Came straight from the site, I presume." "Wouldn't miss it," I replied, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. I approached the table, my eyes already cataloging the visible damage. The pathologist began her preliminary assessment, dictating her observations into a nearby recorder. Subject, Aris Thorne, male, appears to be in his late 40s. Extensive thermal trauma, primarily to the upper torso and head. Signs of blunt force trauma consistent with projectile impact or explosive concussive force. Severe lacerations, shrapnel wounds. Cause of death appears to be a combination of blast injuries and thermal shock. She lifted the sheet further, revealing the full extent of the damage. The skin was mottled, blistered in some areas, charred black in others. It was horrific, but my focus wasn't on the obvious. I leaned closer, examining the edges of the burns, the patterns of the shrapnel. "Notice anything peculiar about the thermal burns?" I asked, pointing to a specific area on Thorne's forearm where the skin was seared in a surprisingly uniform, almost linear fashion, distinct from the surrounding chaotic charring. The depth, the intensity. It doesn't quite align with the general blast pattern. This looks concentrated, as if from a direct, focused heat source, applied before the main explosion, or perhaps from a secondary, distinct event. The pathologist paused, adjusting her magnifying visor. You're right. It's localized, almost too precise for an uncontrolled lab incident. And the surrounding tissue shows less peripheral damage than I'd expect for that level of scorching. My gaze drifted to Thorne's hands. They were badly burned, but I noticed something almost imperceptible under the nail of his right index finger. I gently took his hand, careful not to disturb anything further. Using a fine-tipped forceps, I meticulously extracted a minuscule, iridescent shard. It was no larger than a grain of sand, catching the overhead light with a faint, unnatural shimmer. "What is that?" the pathologist asked, leaning in. I dropped it into a sterile evidence pouch. "That? I don't know. But it's not glass, not metal from the lab, and it doesn't look like any organic matter I've seen. And it's definitely not from an explosion. It has a composite structure, almost crystalline, with a faint, almost pearlescent sheen. And it's too uniform to be natural." My gut tightened. This was the contradiction I was searching for. This was the first thread. I moved to the temporary command center established in an adjacent administrative office, a space now buzzing with the low hum of electronics and the hushed urgency of various agencies. My first interview was with the rival scientist, a Dr. Silas Vance. Vance sat across from me, impeccably dressed, his expression a practiced mask of somber professionalism that didn't quite reach his eyes. "A tragic loss," Vance began, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "Aris was unique. A visionary, perhaps, but often reckless." "Reckless enough to cause an explosion of that magnitude?" I probed. He shrugged, a dismissive gesture. Aris pushed boundaries. He worked on the fringes, often without the necessary oversight. His catalyst project. It was highly volatile. I warned him. Warned him about what, specifically? The inherent instability of his compounds, the risks he was taking. He dismissed my concerns, naturally. Aris saw competition, not collaboration. He was always convinced I was trying to steal his thunder, even when I offered genuine advice. There was a bitterness there, barely concealed, a flicker of resentment in his eyes when he spoke Thorne's name. He was paranoid, secretive. Thought everyone was after his breakthrough. And were you? Vance met my gaze, a cool, calculating stare. After his data? His methods? Every scientist is interested in groundbreaking work, but sabotage? That's absurd. I have my own research, my own legacy to build. I don't need to destroy another's to achieve it. He paused, a faint smirk playing on his lips. Though I admit, his absence does clear the field somewhat. The admission hung in the air, a thinly veiled motive wrapped in plausible deniability. Next, I spoke with the former research assistant, Maya. He was younger, her face drawn, her clothes rumpled. She looked genuinely distressed, though her distress seemed laced with a simmering anger. He was impossible, Maya stated, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. Brilliant, yes, but utterly consumed. He promised me co-authorship, recognition for my contributions to the initial phase of the catalyst research. Then, suddenly, I was out. My access revoked. He said my methodology was too conventional for his unorthodox approach. When was this? I asked. 6 months ago. Just when the project was really gaining traction. He cut me off completely. Wouldn't even return my calls. Said he needed unfettered creative space. The truth is, he was terrified someone would steal his glory. He isolated himself, worked alone. Her hands clenched in her lap. I poured 2 years of my life into that lab. 2 years. And he just discarded me. Did you ever try to regain access? Or confront him? She hesitated. I sent emails. Tried to talk to him. Nothing. I even considered. Well, I considered going public with my original data, showing how much of his breakthrough was built on my foundations, but I didn't. What would be the point? He had all the institutional backing. Her gaze hardened. He deserved to be called out for his arrogance, for his betrayal. But not like this. The interviews concluded, leaving me with 2 distinct motives simmering beneath the surface: professional rivalry and personal betrayal. Vance, driven by ego and ambition, saw Thorne as an obstacle. Maya, fueled by resentment and a sense of injustice, felt exploited. Both had access, or at least intimate knowledge of Thorne's work and the lab's intricacies. I returned to my temporary desk, pulling out the evidence pouch containing the shimmering shard. The autopsy results were starting to paint a picture of deliberate action, not accident. The precise burn, the foreign element. Thorne wasn't just a victim of his own ambition. He was a target. And the game had just begun. The interviews had left a sour taste, a lingering residue of ambition and resentment. Vance, with his carefully constructed facade of concern, and Maya, whose quiet despair felt almost too profound, both offered narratives that twisted around the central mystery like vines. Professional rivalry, personal betrayal, the motives were clear enough, but the means remained a shifting shadow. I needed more than conjecture, I needed facts, hard and cold. The air was cool, smelling faintly of disinfectant and something metallic, a scent that clung to the specialized equipment lining the walls. Rows of gleaming stainless steel surfaces, covered with tarpaulins, hinted at the grim work conducted here. But my focus wasn't on what lay beneath those drapes. My attention was fixed on a secure terminal in a small, windowless alcove, a workstation isolated from the rest of the section by reinforced glass. This was where the digital remnants of Thorne's life, and his death, were being parsed. The lead technician, a stoic man with precise movements, had prepared the access for me. All classified project data from Dr. Thorne's lab has been mirrored here, he explained, his voice flat. System logs, research files, communication records. It's all isolated, offline from external networks. I nodded, settling into the chair. The terminal hummed, its screen displaying a labyrinthine directory. Thorne's work was dense, layers upon layers of highly specialized data. My fingers navigated the interface, sifting through project folders labeled with obscure alphanumeric codes. The scale of his research was immediately apparent: advanced genetic sequencing, far beyond anything I'd encountered in civilian applications. The sheer volume of data suggested years of meticulous effort. Thorne had been playing with fire, or perhaps, with the very blueprint of life itself. Hours blurred into a single, focused stream. I traced data pathways, examined access logs, and cross-referenced file modifications. Most of it was routine, the expected ebb and flow of a dedicated researcher. But then I found it. Deep within a subdirectory, nestled amongst archived sequencing results, I discovered a cluster of project files that had been recently accessed and modified. Not just modified, but scrubbed. The original data was gone, replaced by what appeared to be corrupted placeholders. The timestamps were recent, barely a day before Thorne's death. This wasn't a casual cleanup. This was an intentional, precise act of data manipulation, a digital ghost attempting to erase its tracks. My internal clock screamed. An attempted wipe. And not by a novice. The method implied a deep understanding of Thorne's network architecture, or perhaps, the system itself. Was Thorne trying to hide something at the last minute? Or had someone else gained access, clearing the slate of incriminating evidence? The distinction was crucial. I marked the anomaly, isolating the corrupted files for deeper forensic recovery. The tension in the small alcove seemed to thicken, pressing down on me. Stepping out of the sterile confines, I sought out Maya, Thorne's assistant. I found her in a quiet break area, staring blankly at a lukewarm cup of tea. Her shoulders were hunched, her usually neat hair slightly disheveled. She looked smaller, more fragile than before. "Maya," I said, keeping my voice even. He flinched, his gaze snapping up, wide and almost feral. "Read. Did you find anything?" "I'm still sifting through the data," I replied, choosing my words carefully. I noticed some unusual activity in Thorne's project files, very recent. An attempted data wipe. "Do you know anything about that?" She swallowed hard, her eyes darting away, then back to me, full of a raw, unvarnished fear. I wouldn't know about that. He handled all the sensitive data himself. Guarded. He locked himself away in the lab for days. He started talking about being watched, about his work being compromised. He even changed all the security protocols on his personal terminal, the ones only he had access to. Paranoia? I suggested, watching her closely. She shook her head slowly. Not exactly. It felt more real than that. He was meticulous, you know? Not prone to wild claims. He told me to be careful, that I couldn't trust anyone with what I knew about his work. Thorne's paranoia, if it was indeed paranoia, had coincided perfectly with the sophisticated data manipulation I'd just uncovered. Maya's vague remarks had just complicated everything, painting a picture of a man under siege and a secret project that someone was desperate to keep hidden. The killer wasn't just intimately familiar with Thorne's work, they might have been right there, inside his carefully guarded world. Her words, "he was becoming paranoid," echoed in my mind, a chilling counterpoint to the sophisticated data manipulation I'd unearthed. Paranoia, or prescience? Had Thorne been trying to hide his own tracks, or was someone else expertly scrubbing the digital footprint of their intrusion? Maya's vague remarks had only served to complicate an already tangled web. I needed something concrete, something undeniable, to cut through the ambiguity. My gaze fell to the microscopic trace element, the one that had stubbornly refused to fit any established profile in the lab. The air hummed with the low thrum of specialized equipment, a familiar symphony of precision. The trace element, a speck barely visible to the naked eye, lay nestled in the sample holder of the advanced mass spectrometer. This wasn't a standard lab, it was designed for classified materials, for secrets that couldn't afford to see the light of day. The security protocols here were as intricate as the molecular structures I analyzed. I adjusted the focus, the tiny fleck blooming into a crystalline landscape on the monitor. The machine hummed, a low, persistent growl, as data streamed across the multiple screens before me. Minutes stretched, each second a slow drip of anticipation. I watched the graphs form, peaks and valleys mapping out the elemental composition. Iron, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, the usual suspects appeared, but then, a cluster of signatures emerged, unlike anything I'd seen in standard biological or environmental samples. My fingers danced across the console, cross-referencing against various databases, industrial compounds, obscure alloys, even geological anomalies. Nothing. Then, a subtle shift in the algorithm, a deeper dive into synthetic polymers. The system word, accessing a restricted database, a repository of cutting-edge materials. A new graph materialized, overlaid with my sample's signature. The match was startling, almost perfect. A rare, synthetic polymer. Its designation flashed on screen, Omniflex 7. Omniflex 7. This wasn't some off-the-shelf plastic. This was a high-end industrial application, a specialized material known for its extreme durability and resistance to thermal degradation. It was proprietary, manufactured by only one entity, Omnicorp. My initial line of inquiry, focusing on Thorne's personal life or academic rivals, crumbled. This polymer wasn't something you'd find in a domestic setting, nor was it a byproduct of biological research. It pointed directly to a corporate entity, one with deep pockets and an even deeper interest in advanced materials. Omnicorp. They were a conglomerate, notorious for their aggressive R&D, and I knew they had been a major financier of Thorne's work. The catastrophic lab accident narrative suddenly felt flimsy, deliberately constructed. The implications were stark. This wasn't a suicide, nor a simple accident. This was a deliberate act, executed with a level of precision and access that spoke volumes. The trace element, so tiny, so easily missed, was a breadcrumb leading away from the obvious and into the opaque world of corporate espionage and industrial secrets. Thorne's paranoia, if it was indeed paranoia, had suddenly taken on a terrifying clarity. He hadn't been imagining things. I leaned back, the sterile air of the bay feeling suddenly charged. Their name had always loomed large in the background of Thorne's grants and patents, but now it was front and center. The Omnicorp corporate tower was a monolith of glass and steel, piercing the skyline like a sharpened blade. Its lobby was a symphony of hushed efficiency, gleaming surfaces reflecting the tailored suits of its occupants. I felt an immediate dissonance, my investigative mind clashing with the polished veneer of corporate power. The liaison met me in a sleek, minimalist conference room on the 40th floor. He was impeccably dressed, his smile practiced, his handshake firm but not aggressive. "Reed, thank you for coming," he began, his voice smooth, almost too genial. "We're, of course, deeply saddened by Dr. Thorne's passing. A true visionary." "Indeed," I replied, my gaze unwavering. I watched his eyes, searching for any flicker of discomfort. "My investigation has led me to a few questions regarding Omnicorp's involvement with Dr. Thorne's research, specifically concerning certain proprietary materials." He nodded slowly, maintaining the polite smile. Of course. Omnicorp has a long-standing commitment to fostering groundbreaking innovation. Dr. Thorne's work was particularly promising. Promising enough to warrant the use of OmniFlex 7 in his facility? I asked, dropping the name like a stone into still water. For a fraction of a second, the smile faltered, a micro-expression of surprise or perhaps calculation. It was gone before it truly registered. OmniFlex 7, he repeated, his tone carefully neutral. That's a very specialized polymer. Primarily used in our high-stress industrial applications. I'm not immediately aware of its deployment in Dr. Thorne's research lab. Why do you ask? A trace element was recovered from the scene, I explained, keeping my voice even. Spectral analysis identified it as OmniFlex 7. He steepled his fingers. His gaze drifting to the panoramic view of the city outside. Fascinating, he murmured, more to himself than to me. I'll have to look into that. It's certainly not standard lab equipment. Perhaps Dr. Thorne was experimenting with new structural components for his containment units? He was always pushing boundaries. Or perhaps it was introduced for another purpose entirely, I countered. Omnicorp funded a significant portion of his research. Did you have any direct access to his lab beyond the standard liaison visits? He turned back to me, his smile firmly back in place, perhaps a touch wider now. Our security protocols are stringent, read. Access to Dr. Thorne's lab was highly restricted, even for us. Any visit would have been scheduled, logged, and escorted. As for the OmniFlex 7, I assure you, we're fully committed to assisting your investigation. We'll pull all relevant records, cross-reference manufacturing batches, anything you need. His eagerness felt almost performative, a veneer of cooperation that felt too slick. Too perfect. I appreciate that, I said, my internal alarm bells ringing softly. I'll need those records, along with a full list of all Omnicorp personnel who had any access, however remote, to Dr. Thorne's facility or his project data. Consider it done, he replied, already reaching for his tablet. We want to get to the bottom of this as much as you do. Thorne was an invaluable asset. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, the liaison providing answers that were always just a little too comprehensive, a little too eager to please. He offered databases, personnel lists, even suggested other potential corporate rivals who might have an interest in Thorne's work. It was an overwhelming display of cooperation, designed, I suspected, to bury me in data and deflect suspicion. As I left the gleaming tower, the sun glinting off its glass facade, I knew one thing for certain: the liaison had been overly cooperative, a red flag flapping in the corporate wind. The trace of OmniFlex 7 wasn't just a clue, it was a carefully placed marker, and Omnicorp's reaction to its discovery was anything but transparent. The web of connections was tightening, and I had a feeling the real killer was hiding not in the shadows, but in plain sight, behind a meticulously crafted facade of helpfulness. The corporate liaison's performance had been too polished, the answers too readily available, like pre-packaged explanations waiting for an inquiry. He'd offered access to databases, personnel files, even volunteered potential corporate rivals. All of it felt like a distraction, a carefully constructed maze designed to lead me away from the truth, not towards it. My focus remained on the unique polymer residue. It wasn't standard lab equipment, and its presence on Thorne's remains, even in minute quantities, screened anomaly. I decided to re-examine the samples taken directly from Thorne's body. The initial analysis had been thorough, but I needed to put my own eyes on it again, away from the corporate influence that seemed to permeate every piece of information. Today, however, felt different. A prickle of unease had settled between my shoulder blades since leaving the liaison. I was 3 blocks from the facility, navigating a 4-way intersection with a stale green light, when a delivery van, emblazoned with a generic logistics company logo, swerved sharply into my lane. There was no signal, no warning. Just the sudden, jarring sight of its grimy white side looming in my peripheral vision, its tires squealing against the asphalt. My reflexes, honed by years of quick decisions in volatile environments, kicked in. I wrenched the steering wheel hard to the right, feeling the sedan's tires bite into the curb, the passenger side mirror scraping against a lamppost with a sickening crunch. The van, without so much as a tap of the brakes, sped through the intersection, disappearing around the next corner. My hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white. My breath hitched. That wasn't an accident. The driver had made eye contact for a split second before the swerve, a cold, blank stare that held no surprise, no panic. Just intent. Someone knew I was getting too close. The liaison's eagerness, the sudden near miss, it all coalesced into a chilling certainty. The attendant, a burly individual with a perpetually bored expression, barely glanced at my credentials before waving me through. I spent hours hunched over the spectral analysis equipment, rerunning tests on the microfragments of polymer scraped from Thorne's fingernails and embedded in the singed fabric of his lab coat. My findings were consistent. The polymer was a complex, multi-layered compound, unlike anything commercially available. It had a unique thermal signature, one that suggested it was designed to withstand extreme temperatures, yet somehow, it had partially degraded in the very incident it was meant to contain. This was key. Instead of heading straight home, I drove to my personal lab, a nondescript unit tucked away in an industrial park, a place I considered my sanctuary. It wasn't a high-security facility, but I prided myself on its meticulous order and my own vigilance. The first thing I noticed was the faint scent of ozone. Subtle, almost imperceptible, but distinct to my senses. Then, the floor mat, usually perfectly aligned with the door frame, was skewed by a fraction of an inch. A detail so minor, most wouldn't notice, but I did. My eyes scanned the room, every object in its accustomed place. The microscope sat on its stand, covers neatly in place. The chromatography equipment was powered down. Nothing seemed disturbed. But the ozone, the mat. I walked over to my workbench. A small, sealed container held the remaining polymer samples from Thorne's lab. I had labeled it meticulously, noting the exact weight and date. Now, the label was slightly askew, a corner peeled back just enough to reveal a faint, almost invisible fingerprint smudge beneath it. Not mine. I always handled those containers with gloves. Someone had been in my lab. Someone had been looking at my samples. This wasn't a warning, it was a violation. My sanctuary had been breached, my work compromised. They weren't just trying to slow me down, they were actively trying to see what I knew, perhaps even to interfere with my evidence. I was no longer just investigating a death, I was in a direct confrontation. I needed to talk to Maya. The liaison had dismissed her as a grieving assistant, but her terrified eyes kept replaying in my mind. He was the last person to see Thorne alive, the first to find him dead. If anyone had seen something out of place, it would be her. I called her, my voice low and steady despite the tremor in my own hand. "I need to speak with you. Urgently. Can you meet me somewhere safe? A public place, but quiet?" A long pause stretched between us, punctuated by her shallow breathing. "The old diner, on Elm Street. Midnight. I think I have something to tell you." The old diner was almost empty when I arrived. A single cook wiped down the counter, and a couple of truckers nursed lukewarm coffee in a far booth. Maya was already there, huddled in a booth near the back, her face pale under the dim fluorescent lights. "Since Thorne, I keep thinking about things. Little things. But after what happened yesterday, with you asking all those questions, and then the call from the company's internal security about my unauthorized comments. I knew I had to tell you. What happened yesterday?" I pressed gently, leaning forward. "A car. It followed me home from the lab. It parked down the street for hours. And then this morning, my apartment building's fire alarm went off for no reason, and when I came back, my door was slightly ajar. Nothing was taken, but before Thorne's death." She took a shaky breath, her eyes finally meeting mine, wide with fear. "It started a few weeks ago. Late at night. I'd sometimes come back to the lab to finish up some reports, or retrieve something I'd forgotten. The security system, it was always armed. But a few times, I noticed the armed light on the panel was flickering. Like it had just been disarmed and then rearmed very quickly. I thought it was a glitch. And I prompted, my heart picking up pace. And one night, about a week before it happened, I saw him. A man. He was leaving Thorne's private lab section. Not through the main entrance, but through the service corridor that leads to the loading dock. He moved quickly, almost like he didn't want to be seen. I just caught a glimpse as he slipped out. I thought it was odd, but Thorne often worked late, and sometimes had unusual visitors. And he wasn't supposed to be there after hours, not without Thorne's explicit authorization. "Did you recognize him?" She wrung her hands. "No. Not at all. But he was tall. He moved with a purpose, Reed. Like he knew exactly where he was going, and what he was doing. An unknown individual, accessing Thorne's lab after hours, just days before his death, carrying a case. This was the break I needed. And now, a new player had entered the game. The hum of the servers in the temporary forensics lab was the only sound for hours, a low, constant thrum against the silence of my concentration. I sat hunched over the main console, fingers dancing across the illuminated keyboard, eyes tracking lines of code and data logs that scrolled relentlessly across the 5 large monitors. The lab's environmental control system, its bespoke security architecture, Thorne's personal network, I had them all laid bare. The unknown individual with the case, captured on a grainy feed days before Thorne's death, was the ghost in the machine I was hunting. I rewound the feed, isolating the moment the individual exited the lab. Nothing seemed amiss. No obvious tampering with the door, no alarm triggers. It was too clean, too professional. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was surgical. I cross-referenced the entry/exit logs with Thorne's schedule. He was away at a conference during that window. A perfect opportunity for an undisturbed infiltration. My attention shifted to the environmental controls. Thorne's lab was a marvel of precision, maintaining exact atmospheric compositions for his sensitive bioengineering work. Any deviation, no matter how minor, would be logged. I started with the days leading up to the incident, then zeroed in on the hours immediately preceding the explosion. It was like searching for a single, misaligned grain of sand on a vast beach. Then I saw it. Not an alarm, not an error message, but a fractional, almost imperceptible shift in the inert gas mixture within the main chamber. It lasted mere seconds, logged as a system recalibration, but it was outside the standard deviation. A ghost in the data, just like the individual in the footage. I isolated the timestamp. It occurred roughly 45 minutes before the catastrophic event. Too early to be the immediate cause, but too specific to be random. My mind raced, reconstructing the scene. Thorne, meticulous as he was, would have been immersed in his work. He wouldn't have noticed a subtle, transient change in the air. Not at first. I pictured him, bent over a workbench, perhaps adjusting a complex bioreactor. The brief gas fluctuation, though tiny, would have been enough to prime the system, to subtly alter the atmospheric pressure or composition around certain critical equipment. A precursor. A setup. I dug deeper, correlating the environmental logs with the diagnostic readouts from the reactor that ultimately failed. These weren't random. They were too precise, too sequential. Each one nudged the reactor closer to its operational limit, but never quite breached it, not yet. It was like tuning a violin string tighter and tighter, just shy of snapping. The system indicated manual overrides, remote commands issued from an external, untraceable IP address. Not a full system takeover, which would have triggered immediate alarms, but targeted injections, tiny digital manipulations that mimicked internal system responses. A ghost hand guiding the reactor to its doom. The sequence clicked into place, chilling in its sophistication. Stage 1, the incapacitation. Roughly 45 minutes before the blast, a remote command initiated a gradual, almost undetectable depletion of oxygen within Thorne's immediate working zone, coupled with the introduction of a specific inert gas. Not enough to kill instantly, but enough to induce disorientation, a creeping fatigue, impaired judgment. Thorne would have felt unwell, perhaps blamed it on overwork, and been unable to react effectively when the true danger materialized. The subtle environmental log entry was the signature of this initial phase. Stage 2, the priming. As Thorne's faculties dimmed, a second series of remote commands targeted the main bioreactor. These weren't direct system failures but subtle, repeated pressure increases, temperature spikes, all designed to push the equipment to its absolute breaking point, while still remaining within a plausible malfunction range. This was the series of microfluctuations I'd found in the reactor's diagnostics. Stage 3, the catastrophe. Finally, once Thorne was sufficiently disoriented and the reactor primed, the killer triggered the last command. Not an explosion, not a system failure, but a precisely timed overload that caused the specific polymer Thorne was working with to destabilize violently, creating the devastating, localized blast. I leaned back, the chair groaning under my weight. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't suicide. It was a meticulously orchestrated murder, a multi-stage operation that leveraged Thorne's own highly specialized equipment and protocols against him. The killer wasn't just smart, they were intimately familiar with Thorne's lab, his research, even his daily habits. They knew the exact tolerances of his machines, the specific properties of his compounds. This wasn't just an expert, this was an insider. The implications settled over me like a shroud. The individual with the case, the one who entered the lab days before, had likely installed the remote trigger, or perhaps even modified a component to accept these precise, untraceable commands. The polymer, the accidents I'd seen in the burn patterns, they were all pieces of a terrifyingly coherent puzzle. I gathered my notes, the digital evidence now neatly archived. The next step was to confirm my hypothesis with the physical evidence, to see if Thorne's body showed signs of the initial incapacitation before the final trauma. The facility itself was stark, a concrete monolith rising from the earth, its security as formidable as its purpose. I navigated the labyrinthine corridors, each door requiring a new clearance, a new scan. She stood over Thorne's remains, bathed in the harsh, directional lights of the examination table. The scene was clinical, devoid of emotion, yet profoundly unsettling. "Read," he acknowledged, not looking up from his examination. "Finished with your digital sleuthing?" "I have some theories," I said, approaching the table, keeping a respectful distance. "I believe Thorne was incapacitated before the main event. A gradual oxygen depletion, perhaps combined with an inert gas. Would you find evidence of that?" She paused, her instruments resting on a steel tray. The initial findings pointed to the blast trauma as the immediate cause of death, of course. But there were anomalies. Signs of cerebral hypoxia, consistent with oxygen deprivation, prior to the concussive injuries. We attributed it to the general environment of the blast, but the timeline was off. And the specific gas? Could you identify it? She picked up a small vial. Trace elements in the lung tissue. Xenon. A heavy, inert gas. Not usually lethal in small concentrations, but potent enough to displace oxygen in a closed environment, especially when combined with a controlled reduction of ambient O2. It would induce disorientation, confusion, slow reactions. Xenon. An expensive, specialized gas, often used in specific research applications. Thorne would have had access to it. The pieces locked into place with a horrifying click. The killer had used Thorne's own resources, his own expertise, to create the perfect murder. And the nature of the blast? I asked, my voice low. Localized, highly energetic. Consistent with the rapid destabilization of that polymer he was working with. But the initiation point. It was too clean. Too focused. Not a general system failure. She met my gaze, a flicker of understanding in her eyes. You're saying someone made it happen. Someone did more than make it happen, I replied, the sterile air suddenly feeling heavy. And they knew exactly how to do it. The implications were stark. This wasn't just a murder, it was a declaration. The air here was heavy with the scent of disinfectant and something metallic, a familiar, unsettling combination. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh, shadowless glare on the stainless steel surfaces. I watched the medical examiner, a gaunt woman with tired eyes and precise movements, as he carefully documented Thorne's remains. No change from the preliminary findings, Reed, he stated, his voice flat. The primary cause is still consistent with the thermal shock and subsequent systemic failure. But the localized burn pattern. It's still an anomaly. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the detailed photographs displayed on a screen beside the examination table. The burn wasn't just deep, it was focused, almost surgical in its precision, as if a pinpoint of intense energy had been directed at a specific neural cluster. Not random, not an accident. And the trace element? I asked, referring to the microscopic residue I'd found earlier. Still unidentifiable, she admitted, shaking her head. Not in any standard database. It's a complex molecular structure, highly stable and inert, yet it clearly interacted with Thorne's tissue at the cellular level, exacerbating the thermal damage. Whatever it is, it's designed to leave minimal trace. My mind raced, connecting the dots that were slowly, painstakingly, forming a picture. The medical examiner's words solidified my growing conviction. This wasn't a botched experiment or a desperate act of self-destruction. This was deliberate, sophisticated. A killer who knew not just Thorne's lab, but Thorne himself, his physical vulnerabilities, perhaps even his precise location within the blast radius. Someone who had engineered not just a death, but an erasure. The implications were stark, just as I'd realized back in the lab. This wasn't just a murder, it was a declaration. Theft of research felt too simple for this level of intricate planning. If they wanted the data, they could have taken it. The lab was designed to protect the work, not its creator. No, this felt like something else entirely. It wasn't about stealing Thorne's work, it was about preventing its completion or public release. My next stop wasn't the lab, not yet. It was Thorne's personal digital footprint. He was a man of routines, of meticulous documentation. If he felt threatened, if he knew he was sitting on something explosive, he would have left a trail. He had to. Back in my temporary workspace, a cramped office within the corporate building that housed Thorne's former lab, I dove into the digital archives. Thorne's primary research logs were extensive, detailing his experiments, observations, and theoretical breakthroughs. I'd scoured them for inconsistencies, for any hint of a struggle or a clandestine meeting, but found nothing obvious. Everything pointed to a man consumed by his work, right up until the end. But what if the killer wasn't just after the results of his research, but the implications? What if Thorne had stumbled onto something he wasn't supposed to, something that threatened powerful interests? I remembered a peculiar file naming convention Thorne sometimes used, an obscure astronomical term followed by a string of seemingly random characters. It was a digital fingerprint, something only he would recognize as a marker for sensitive data. I began my search, running a script to scan for similar patterns across Thorne's entire digital estate, not just the lab servers, but his personal cloud backups, his encrypted external drives. Hours blurred as lines of code scrolled across my multiple monitors. The air grew thick with the smell of stale coffee and my own growing frustration. Then, a hit. A file with the exact naming convention, encrypted with a layer of security far more robust than anything else in his system. My fingers flew across the keyboard, running decryption algorithms I'd developed over years of chasing digital ghosts. The processor whirred, the cooling fans kicking into high gear. The suspense was a physical weight in my chest. Finally, the file unlocked. It wasn't a research log in the traditional sense. It was a personal journal, a raw, unfiltered account of Thorne's growing unease. Omnicorp's funding for Project Chimera is a front. They're not interested in regenerative medicine, they're interested in control. My discoveries can be weaponized, not just against disease, but against populations. The ethical lines are blurring, then disappearing entirely. My breath hitched. Omnicorp. The very corporation that owned the building, that had funded Thorne's entire career. Entry March 28, 2047. I've uncovered their clandestine funding of a separate, far more dangerous project. It's buried deep, shielded by layers of shell corporations. They're developing a neurotoxin, highly specific, designed for targeted incapacitation. My research is merely a stepping stone for them, a way to perfect the delivery mechanism. I cannot let this stand. Entry April 5, 2047. I'm preparing to expose them. The data is compiled, cross-referenced. It will bring them down. I have to. The world needs to know what they are truly building. The final entry was dated 2 days before his death. The words burned into my vision. This wasn't just about a stolen formula, it was about preventing a global catastrophe. Thorne hadn't been murdered for his research, but for his integrity. The killer hadn't just wanted to steal his work, they wanted to bury a truth that could shatter Omnicorp. The game hadn't just escalated, it had fundamentally changed. I was no longer hunting a killer in a lab, I was unraveling a corporate conspiracy, and I had just painted a target on my own back. The tension in the small room was palpable, a heavy cloak settling over me. I wasn't just investigating a murder, I was stepping into a war. This wasn't a heist gone wrong, or a desperate act of industrial espionage. Thorne was a whistleblower, plain and simple, trying to expose something catastrophic, and someone had silenced him before he could speak. My focus sharpened, the abstract hunt for a killer now a concrete pursuit of a saboteur, a cover-up artist. The stakes weren't just about justice for Thorne, they were about preventing whatever global catastrophe he'd warned about. The air was sterile, hushed, the only sounds the soft hum of servers and the quiet clicks of my keyboard. Files piled up on the glowing screen, blueprints of Thorne's lab, intricate schematics of his research equipment, security camera feeds, and, most critically, the full access logs and employee profiles for everyone with clearance to the facility. My fingers flew across the keys, driven by a growing urgency. The sabotage of Thorne's lab had been meticulously executed, requiring an intimate knowledge of the systems, the failsafes, and the specific vulnerabilities of his advanced bioreactor. This wasn't a blunt instrument job, it was precision work, almost surgical in its application. I started by cross-referencing the access card swipes and biometric entries against the timing of the incident. The system was robust, leaving little room for error. Only a handful of individuals had been granted the highest level of clearance, allowing them unrestricted access to the inner sanctum where Thorne worked. I filtered the list further, overlaying the technical requirements of the sabotage. Who possessed the specialized engineering knowledge to not just operate, but to deliberately compromise a bioreactor of that complexity? Who understood the specific resonant frequencies, the pressure points, the subtle environmental triggers that could induce a catastrophic failure while mimicking an accident? The field narrowed significantly. Most of the lab personnel were specialists in biochemistry or genetics, not system architecture or covert demolition. Then there were the financial records, the project budgets, the external liaisons. Omnicorp had funded a significant portion of Thorne's research, and their oversight had been constant. I pulled up the profile of their primary liaison, a man whose name was listed as David Thorne, no relation, the file quickly confirmed. He was often on site, a constant presence, ostensibly ensuring corporate interests were protected. His access level was surprisingly high for someone not directly involved in the scientific work. I clicked into David Thorne's personnel file. Most of it was standard corporate boilerplate, education, previous positions, performance reviews. But something felt off. The dates for his employment with Omnicorp were solid, but the preceding years were vague, almost deliberately sparse. A gap. My eyes scanned the screen, looking for any anomaly, any thread to pull. There it was, tucked away in a footnote, a mention of special projects before his tenure at Omnicorp, vaguely attributed to a security consulting firm that no longer existed. My investigative instincts flared. Special projects was corporate speak for something outside the norm, often something covert. I ran a quick background check, digging deeper into the defunct security firm. The pieces began to click into place, an unsettling pattern emerging from the digital dust. Further digging, through archived news articles and obscure industry reports, revealed more. The defunct firm had been implicated years ago in a major scandal involving stolen intellectual property from a rival biotech company. No charges were ever filed, the case quietly settled out of court, but the architect of the breach was never publicly identified. David Thorne, the Omnicorp liaison. The man was an expert at making things disappear, at creating plausible deniability. He was the architect. He was the inside man. Thorne wasn't just murdered, he was professionally neutralized, his integrity seen as a threat to a powerful corporation with a history of ruthlessness. David Thorne wasn't merely a suspect, he was the prime mover, the one who could have orchestrated this catastrophic accident from within. The game had just changed. I leaned back from the glowing screen, the sterile air of the restricted section doing little to cool the fire now burning in my gut. I had my target. Now, it was my turn to make that someone show their hand. I'd spent the last 24 hours meticulously crafting the bait. A fabricated report, subtly leaked through channels I knew the corporate liaison monitored, detailing a critical stabilization matrix for Thorne's experimental compound. It was a phantom breakthrough, a ghost in the machine designed to lure the killer out. Only someone intimately aware of Thorne's true work, the weaponization potential he was fighting against, would understand the urgency of such a discovery. They wouldn't just want the research, they'd want it gone. I sat back, the sterile glow of my monitor reflecting in my tired eyes. The waiting was the hardest part, a slow grind against my patience. I'd arranged for a staged transfer of the findings to a secure, off-site location later that night. A location I knew the corporate liaison had access to, one he'd used before to discreetly retrieve or tamper with information. The call came just before midnight, a clipped report from a colleague monitoring the facility's internal network. Read, "We have activity. Someone's accessed the secure data vault where those Thorne files were staged. He'd taken the bait." "Initiate lockdown protocols," I instructed, my voice flat, betraying none of the adrenaline now coursing through me. "Do not engage. Just contain." I moved fast, grabbing my kit. The facility was a maze of reinforced corridors and biometric scanners, but I knew the quickest route to the secure data vault. This wasn't just about Thorne anymore, it was about the attempts on my own life, that accidents designed to remove me from the investigation. I carried the proof of that with me. When I arrived, the vault door stood ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the dim corridor. Inside, the corporate liaison, Thorne's own brother, was hunched over a server rack, a data wipe device clutched in his hand. His face, usually composed, was a mask of frantic concentration, sweat beading on his forehead. He hadn't heard me approach. Looking for something, or just trying to erase it? I asked, my voice cutting through the hum of the servers. The device clattered to the floor. "Reed," he stammered, attempting to compose himself, "what are you doing here?" I was just checking on the security protocols. That's quite the audit tool. He took a step back, his gaze darting around the room, searching for an escape that wasn't there. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Let's cut the pretense," I said, my voice hardening. Aris was trying to expose Omnicorp's bioweapon development. He was going to blow the whistle. And you, his own brother, were tasked with neutralizing him. I laid a series of magnified images on a nearby workstation's surface. The breakthrough report was a lure. You fell for it because it represented everything you were trying to prevent from getting out. His eyes flickered to the images, then back to me. A vein throbbed in his temple. "This," I continued, pointing to a microphotograph, "is a unique polymer, a synthetic binder agent. We found trace amounts of it in Aris's lab, embedded in the scorched remains of the containment unit. It's what allowed the dispersal device to function precisely, ensuring maximum destruction and minimal forensic residue." I paused, letting that sink in. "We also found identical traces of this polymer at the scenes of my own accidents. The brake fluid line on my car, the ventilation system in my apartment. A signature, wouldn't you say?" His composure fractured. The corporate mask slipped, revealing a man cornered, desperate. I was. They found out Aris was compiling a dossier. He was going to leak everything about Project Chimera, the weaponized pathogen. Omnicorp couldn't afford that. Not with the contracts they had lined up. They offered me a way out. A promotion, security for my family. If I could just handle Aris. The words hung in the air, heavy with betrayal. Handle him? I repeated, the disgust clear in my tone. By staging a lab accident? By trying to kill me? He was going to ruin everything, he cried, his voice rising, raw with a twisted blend of fear and self-pity. The company, my future, our future. They said they'd make sure I paid for his insubordination if I didn't comply. They control everything. They tasked me. I modified the containment field generator in his lab, using a precise, targeted burst of energy. The polymer was used in the custom-built trigger mechanism. Clean. Untraceable. And then, when you started digging, the tension in the room, thick and suffocating moments before, now solidified into the grim reality of a salt case and a family shattered. The secure data vault, once a crucible of truth, now felt like a tomb. David Thorne, his face a mask of ruined ambition and terror, was led away by the waiting agents. His confession, a torrent of fear and justification, echoed in my mind. Aris Thorne wasn't just silenced, he was betrayed by his own blood, sacrificed on the altar of corporate ambition and a brother's desperate self-preservation. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning of the real fight. The subsequent hours blurred into a whirlwind of official statements, warrants, and coordinated arrests. David Thorne's testimony, backed by the meticulous evidence my team and I had painstakingly gathered, ripped through Omnicorp like a wildfire. The dominoes, once so carefully balanced, were now toppling with an alarming, satisfying speed. I watched the news reports from a small, sterile office within the investigative headquarters, the muted glow of a dozen screens illuminating the faces of my colleagues. The headlines screamed, "Omnicorp scandal rocks biotech world, Thorne's brother implicated in murder conspiracy, ethical breach or corporate espionage?" The public's shock was palpable, a collective gasp reverberating through the digital ether. Aris Thorne, the reclusive genius, was no longer just a brilliant mind lost to a tragic accident. He was a victim, and his death exposed a rot that ran deeper than anyone had imagined. The ethical debate ignited immediately. Its potential, both for good and for catastrophic misuse, hung heavy in the air, a dangerous prize. The air was cool, carrying the faint, metallic scent of disinfectant. I stood before the chief forensic pathologist, a quiet, precise individual, as he presented the final, official findings on Aris Thorne's remains. The reports detailed the exact cause of death, the precise sequence of events, and the microscopic traces that had first alerted me to the deception. Every detail I had suspected, every anomaly I had chased, was now confirmed, sealed by the authority of science and law. It was a somber closure, a final validation of Aris's silent plea for justice. The official cause of death has been updated to homicide. "Read," the pathologist stated, his voice low, his eyes meeting mine with a shared understanding of the gravity. "The unique burn patterns. The specific residue. It all aligns perfectly with the device described in the confession." I nodded, absorbing the finality of it. The truth was ugly, but it was complete. I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and renewed determination. This wasn't just about Aris anymore, it was about the dangerous precedent his death set, about the moral lines blurred in the pursuit of power and profit. The political fallout was immense. Governments and international organizations, recognizing the world-changing implications of Aris Thorne's research, began vying for control. The patents, the data, the very future of the technology, it all became a battleground. Emergency sessions were convened, treaties invoked, and legal teams mobilized. The project, designed to revolutionize energy production and environmental sustainability, was now a geopolitical hot potato, its fate uncertain. I found myself briefing intelligence officials, legal representatives from multiple nations, and congressional committees. Each meeting was a stark reminder of the sheer scale of the forces Aris Thorne had unknowingly unleashed. The city outside buzzed with the news, the faces on the digital billboards reflecting the outrage and fear. My part in uncovering the truth was done, but the wider implications, the ethical quagmire, the struggle for control over Aris's legacy, that was just beginning. The fight for justice had expanded beyond a single murder, morphing into a global debate on the very soul of scientific advancement and corporate responsibility. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the shadow of Aris Thorne's genius, and his tragic end, would loom large over the world for years to come. It was a monotonous drone, a constant reminder of the finality that permeated these walls. I sat alone in the observation gallery, the thick glass before me reflecting my own tired face, superimposed over the gleaming, unoccupied steel table in the room below. The truth about Aris Thorne was indeed ugly, but it was complete. The file on the polished metal console before me was thin now, stripped of its active investigation status, relegated to a summary of facts. Thorne's groundbreaking research, once poised to reshape entire industries, had become his tombstone. The official conclusion detailed the meticulous, almost artistic, precision with which the architect of the plot had orchestrated the catastrophic lab accident. It was a testament to cold, calculating intellect, a mind that saw human life as a variable in a complex equation of profit and power. I traced the edge of a redacted paragraph with my thumb, remembering the microscopic trace, the unusual burn pattern that had first snagged my attention. They were whispers in the chaos, faint signals of a deliberate intent disguised as tragic mischance. They had exploited Thorne's reclusive nature, his unwavering focus on his work, and the very security measures designed to protect his innovations. The poison, undetectable in its initial application, designed to mimic a systemic failure of the lab's environmental controls, leading to the devastating explosion. The subsequent manipulation of forensic data, the carefully planted false leads, all designed to point towards either suicide or a fatal error on Thorne's part. It was a masterclass in deception, a calculated gamble that had nearly paid off. The full scope of their ambition still sent a shiver down my spine. It wasn't just about stealing Thorne's research, it was about controlling its dissemination, shaping its narrative, ensuring it served their agenda exclusively. They saw Thorne as a brilliant but naive instrument, a means to an end. His independent spirit, his ethical boundaries, his very existence, became obstacles. The murder was not an act of passion but of strategic elimination, a pruning of an inconvenient branch. The personal toll of this investigation had been substantial. Sleepless nights spent poring over schematics, chemical analyses, security logs. The faces of those who had genuinely admired Thorne, now etched with a grief that compounded the injustice. It was a stark reminder that the pursuit of progress, unchecked by ethical guardrails, could become a perilous race to the bottom. There were moments, late in the night, when the intricate web of deceit felt overwhelming, when the sheer audacity of the killer threatened to crush my resolve. Doubts would creep in. Had I missed something? Was this too elaborate to be true? The unique residue from the specialized incendiary agent, the subtle alteration in the lab's ventilation logs that pointed to an external override, the faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on a specific piece of equipment that only a microscopic examination could reveal. These were the anchors, the truths I clung to, guiding me through the fog of lies. My commitment to this work, to forensic justice, felt sharper now, honed by the grim reality of Thorne's demise. Someone had to speak for the silent, to piece together the fractured remnants of their final moments and expose the hidden machinations that led to their end. It wasn't just about catching a killer, it was about upholding a standard, ensuring that even in the face of immense power and influence, the truth could still find its voice. It was about drawing a line, however faint, against the encroachment of unchecked ambition. The conspirator was now facing justice, their meticulously constructed empire of lies crumbling around them. Thorne's research, once a pawn in a deadly game, was now under protective custody, its future to be determined by those who understood its potential and its inherent dangers. There was a sense of closure, a quiet satisfaction in seeing the pieces fall into place, in knowing that Aris Thorne, in his quiet brilliance, had not died in vain, his death exposing a rot far deeper than any lab accident. I pushed the file away, the metallic clatter echoing slightly in the quiet space. The hum of the ventilation system continued, a steady pulse against the lingering tension in the air. This chapter was closed, but the broader narrative of progress versus peril, of ethics battling ambition, was far from over. It was an ongoing struggle, a relentless push and pull that defined the cutting edge of human endeavor. A junior colleague, her face serious, held a new file. Its cover was stark, unadorned, save for a single, ominous code. She didn't speak, merely laid it on the console where Thorne's file had just rested. I looked down. The initial report detailed an unusual energy signature detected at a remote research outpost, followed by a complete loss of contact. My gaze lingered on the file, then flickered to the empty steel table below. The hum of the ventilation system seemed to intensify, a prelude to the next, equally complex investigation.